The Mississippi heat hung thick over Carter Plantation like a suffocating shroud. The air so dense it seemed to press against the very soul of every living creature within its boundaries. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees like funeral veils, swaying gently in the humid breeze that offered no relief from the oppressive atmosphere. The year was 1789, and the Carter family had ruled these 1,000 acres with an iron fist for 3 generations, their wealth built upon the backs of over 200 enslaved souls. Nathaniel Carter stood on the grand veranda of his mansion, an imposing figure in his tailored coat despite the sweltering heat. At 42, he possessed the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority, his steel-grey eyes surveying his domain with the calculating gaze of a predator. The white columns of his home rose like monuments to his power, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens where his wife, Evangeline, tended to her roses with trembling hands. But beneath the veneer of southern gentility, a darkness festered that would soon consume everything the Carter name represented. "Master Carter," came a voice from behind him. Samuel, his most trusted overseer, approached with the measured steps of a man bearing unwelcome news. "The cotton yield from the eastern fields is down again. The slaves, they seem distracted, sir." Nathaniel's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He knew the source of their distraction, just as he knew the whispers that had begun to circulate among the slave quarters like wildfire. 4 men, Caesar, Tobias, Jeremiah, and Moses, had been granted privileges that defied every convention of plantation hierarchy. They lived in better quarters, ate finer food, and most damning of all, they had access to the master's wife in ways that violated every sacred boundary of Southern society. "Distracted," Nathaniel repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "And what, pray tell, do you believe is the cause of this distraction?" Samuel shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face betraying the knowledge he dared not speak aloud. "I couldn't say for certain, sir, but there's been talk." "There's always talk among slaves, Samuel. It's the nature of their kind to gossip and spread lies." Nathaniel's words were sharp, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something that might have been fear. "See that the work continues. Use the whip, if necessary." As Samuel departed, Nathaniel's gaze fell upon his wife in the garden below. Evangeline Carter had once been the belle of Natchez society, her beauty legendary throughout the Mississippi Territory. Now, at 35, she moved through her daily routines like a ghost haunting her own life, her once bright eyes dulled by shame and resignation. The arrangement had begun 2 years prior, born from Nathaniel's twisted desires and his wife's complete powerlessness to resist. What had started as his private perversion had gradually become an open secret, whispered about in slave quarters and hinted at in the drawing rooms of neighboring plantations. The 4 chosen men, each selected for their physical prowess and discretion, had become unwilling participants in a game that threatened to destroy them all. Caesar, the eldest at 28, worked as the plantation's blacksmith. His powerful frame and intelligent eyes had caught Nathaniel's attention, but it was his literacy, a dangerous secret among slaves, that made him truly valuable. Tobias, barely 22, tended the stables with a gentle touch that belied his imposing stature. Jeremiah, the carpenter, crafted furniture for the big house with hands that shook whenever he was summoned for other duties. And Moses, the youngest at 19, worked in the fields, but possessed a dignity that no amount of degradation could fully extinguish. Each man carried the weight of their forced participation differently. Caesar channeled his rage into his work, hammering iron with a fury that sent sparks flying like fallen stars. Tobias found solace in the horses, creatures who judged neither his circumstances nor his shame. Jeremiah carved his anguish into the wood he shaped, creating pieces of heartbreaking beauty that would outlast the plantation itself. And Moses simply endured, his spirit bending but never quite breaking under the impossible burden placed upon him. As evening approached, the plantation settled into its nightly rhythm. Slaves returned from the fields, their bodies exhausted, but their minds alert to the undercurrents of tension that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. In the big house, Evangeline prepared for another night of humiliation, her hands steady as she arranged her hair despite the tremor in her soul. Nathaniel watched from his study window as Caesar emerged from the smithy, his work clothes stained with sweat and soot. The master's eyes followed the enslaved man's movements with an intensity that spoke of obsession rather than mere ownership. This was no longer simply about power or perversion. It had become something far more dangerous, a compulsion that threatened to consume not just the Carter family, but everyone trapped within the plantation's boundaries. The first whispers had already reached the ears of neighboring plantation owners. At the Whitmore estate, 10 miles to the east, conversations had begun to include carefully veiled references to irregularities at the Carter plantation. Mrs. Abigail Whitmore, the undisputed queen of local society, had started to exclude Evangeline from certain social gatherings, citing vague concerns about propriety. In the slave quarters, the knowledge of what transpired in the big house created its own form of torment. Families were torn between sympathy for the four men and fear of association with their circumstances. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer, and elders shook their heads at the violation of natural order that seemed to poison the very air they breathed. As night fell over Carter Plantation, the weight of secrets pressed down upon every soul within its borders. In the big house, Nathaniel poured himself another glass of bourbon, his hands steady despite the chaos brewing in his mind. Evangeline sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection with eyes that had seen too much. And in their separate quarters, 4 men prepared for another night of degradation, each wondering how much longer they could endure before something inside them finally snapped. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called out, a sound that seemed less like a song and more like a warning of the darkness yet to come. 3 weeks had passed since the whispers first reached the ears of Reverend Josiah Blackwood during his weekly visit to the Whitmore plantation. The elderly minister, whose sermons on moral rectitude had shaped the spiritual landscape of the Mississippi Territory for over 2 decades, found himself in the unprecedented position of confronting rumors so scandalous they challenged the very foundations of Christian society. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Carter plantation as Reverend Blackwood's carriage rolled up the oak-lined drive. His weathered hands gripped his Bible with white knuckles, his mind wrestling with the delicate task ahead. As a man of God, he was bound to address sin wherever it festered. But as a pragmatist who understood the delicate social fabric of plantation society, he knew that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Nathaniel Carter received the Reverend in his study, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and furnished with pieces crafted by Jeremiah's skilled hands. The irony was not lost on either man, though only one of them was aware of it. "Reverend Blackwood," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying its usual authority despite the slight tremor that betrayed his inner turmoil. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" The Reverend settled into his chair, his pale blue eyes studying Nathaniel with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading souls. "I've come to speak with you about matters of spiritual concern, Nathaniel. There are whispers in the community that trouble me greatly. Whispers are the currency of idle minds, Reverend. Surely a man of your wisdom doesn't give credence to plantation gossip. When those whispers concern the sanctity of Christian marriage and the proper order of society, I'm afraid I must take them seriously." Blackwood's voice carried the weight of moral authority that had cowed sinners for decades. "Tell me, Nathaniel, how fares your wife? I notice she's been absent from recent church services." Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Evangeline has been unwell. The heat affects her delicate constitution." "Indeed." The Reverend's tone suggested he found this explanation insufficient. "And your household? I trust all remains in proper Christian order." The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Nathaniel understood the true nature of the inquiry, just as he understood that his response would determine whether the Reverend became an ally or an enemy in the trials to come. "My household operates according to the natural order established by God himself," Nathaniel replied carefully. "Master and slave, each in their proper place." Reverend Blackwood leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Nathaniel's face. "The natural order, yes. But I wonder, my son, if you truly understand what that order entails. The Bible speaks clearly about the duties of a husband to his wife and the proper treatment of those under our dominion." Meanwhile, in the plantation's kitchen, Evangeline Carter sat with her personal maid, Ruth, a woman whose loyalty had been tested beyond all reasonable limits. Ruth had served the Carter family for 15 years, had helped raise Evangeline from a nervous bride into the mistress of a great plantation. Now she watched helplessly as that same woman withered under the weight of her husband's perversions. "Miss Evangeline," Ruth said softly, her dark hands gentle as she arranged her mistress's hair. "You barely touched your breakfast again. You need to keep your strength up." Evangeline's reflection in the mirror showed a woman aged beyond her years, her once luminous skin now pale and drawn. "Strength for what purpose, Ruth? To endure another day of this existence." "Don't talk like that, miss. Things have a way of changing when you least expect it." "Do they?" Evangeline's laugh held no humor. "I see no change on the horizon, only more of the same degradation night after night." Ruth's hands stilled in her mistress's hair. She had witnessed things no servant should see, had been forced to prepare her mistress for encounters that violated every principle of decency she held dear. Yet her loyalty to Evangeline remained unshaken, even as her respect for Nathaniel Carter crumbled like ancient mortar. "Miss Evangeline, there's something you should know," Ruth said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure they weren't overheard. "The other plantations, they're talking. Mrs. Whitmore sent word that you're no longer welcome at the ladies' auxiliary meetings." Evangeline's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. The social isolation she had feared was beginning to manifest, the invisible walls of Southern society closing around her like a prison. What reason did she give? She said there were concerns about moral influence among the ladies. "Miss Evangeline, if the rumors have reached that far," the implications hung unspoken between them. In a society where reputation was everything, where a woman's worth was measured by her virtue and her family's standing, Evangeline Carter was becoming a pariah through no choice of her own. In the plantation's smithy, Caesar worked with methodical precision, each strike of his hammer against the anvil a release of the rage that threatened to consume him. His literacy, hidden from all but a trusted few, had become both blessing and curse. He could read the newspapers that occasionally made their way to the plantation, could understand the broader political currents that shaped their world. He knew that change was coming to the institution of slavery, but he also knew that such change moved with the speed of geological time, far too slowly to save him from his current torment. Tobias entered the smithy, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by an agitation that set Caesar immediately on edge. The younger man's hands shook as he approached, his eyes darting nervously toward the big house. "Caesar," Tobias whispered, his voice barely audible above the ringing of hammer on steel. "We need to talk, all of us, tonight." Caesar set down his hammer, studying his friend's face with growing concern. "What's happened?" "Jeremiah heard something from the house slaves. There's talk of bringing in others. The master, he's not satisfied with just the 4 of us anymore." The words hit Caesar like a physical blow. The thought that their degradation might expand, that other men might be forced into their nightmare, filled him with a fury so intense it threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained self-control. "Who?" Caesar asked, his voice deadly quiet. Young David from the stables and Marcus from the cotton fields. Jeremiah says the master's been watching them, asking questions about their attributes. Caesar's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. David was barely 18, a boy whose spirit hadn't yet been fully broken by the realities of plantation life. Marcus, though older at 25, had a wife and 2 small children in the slave quarters. The thought of either man being drawn into their circle of degradation was unbearable. "We meet tonight," Caesar said finally, after the evening bell, the old tobacco barn. As Tobias departed, Caesar returned to his work with renewed intensity. Each strike of the hammer now carried a different purpose, not just the release of rage, but the forging of resolve. Something had to change, and if change wouldn't come from above, it would have to come from within. That evening, as Reverend Blackwood's carriage disappeared down the oak-lined drive, Nathaniel Carter stood once again on his veranda, surveying his domain with eyes that saw cracks forming in the foundation of his world. The Reverend's visit had been a warning, thinly veiled but unmistakable. The whispers were growing louder, the circle of knowledge expanding beyond the plantation's boundaries. In the distance, the evening bell tolled, calling slaves to their quarters for the night. But in the shadows of the old tobacco barn, 4 men gathered to discuss the unthinkable, the possibility that their only escape from degradation might require them to risk everything, including their lives. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, and the nightbirds began their mournful songs. Change was coming to Carter Plantation, whether Nathaniel Carter willed it or not. The old tobacco barn stood like a monument to forgotten prosperity, its weathered boards bearing witness to decades of Mississippi summers and winters. Built in the early days of the Carter Plantation, it had been abandoned when newer, more efficient structures were erected closer to the main house. Now it served as a sanctuary for conversations that could never take place in the light of day. Caesar arrived first, his massive frame moving silently through the shadows cast by the quarter moon. The familiar scent of aged tobacco still lingered in the air, mixing with the earthier smells of decay and neglect. He had chosen this place carefully, far enough from the slave quarters to avoid detection, yet close enough to the woods to provide escape routes if necessary. Tobias appeared next, his gentle nature evident even in the way he moved through the darkness, careful not to disturb the small creatures that made their homes in the abandoned structure. Jeremiah followed, his carpenter's hands automatically testing the stability of the old beams as he entered. Moses came last, his youth evident in the slight tremor of his movements, though his eyes held a determination that belied his 19 years. The 4 men arranged themselves in a circle on the dirt floor, their voices barely above whispers despite the isolation of their meeting place. Caesar, as the eldest and most respected among them, spoke first. "Tobias has told you what Jeremiah heard," he began, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled fury. "The master plans to expand his collection." Jeremiah nodded grimly, his hands clenched into fists. "I was working on repairs to the master's study when I overheard him talking to Samuel. He mentioned David and Marcus specifically, said he wanted to diversify his stable as if we were horses to be bred." Moses, the youngest among them, spoke with a voice that cracked slightly under the strain of emotion. "David's just a boy. He doesn't deserve this. None of us did. But he's so young." "And Marcus has a family," Tobias added quietly. "His wife, Sarah, she's with child again. If he's forced into this arrangement, it'll destroy them both." Caesar studied each of his companions, seeing in their faces the same mixture of rage, despair, and desperate hope that he felt in his own heart. They were bound together by circumstances beyond their control, united in degradation, but also in their shared humanity. "We can't let this continue," Caesar said finally. "Not for us, and certainly not for David and Marcus. The question is, what can we do about it?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken possibilities. Each man understood the gravity of their situation. Slaves who resisted their masters faced punishments that ranged from brutal whippings to death. Yet the alternative, continued participation in Nathaniel Carter's perverse arrangements, seemed equally unbearable. "We could run," Moses suggested, his voice barely audible. "Head north, try to reach free territory." Jeremiah shook his head. 4 slaves disappearing at once? They'd have the dogs on us before we made it 10 miles. And even if we escaped, what about our families? What about David and Marcus? The master would take his anger out on everyone left behind. "Then we fight," Tobias said, surprising the others with the steel in his usually gentle voice. "We've all thought about it. I know we have. The master can't force us to do anything if he's dead." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Murder. The ultimate transgression, the one act that would transform them from victims into criminals in the eyes of the law. Yet as they sat in the darkness of the abandoned barn, each man found himself considering the possibility with a clarity that both terrified and liberated him. "If we killed him," Caesar said slowly, "we'd have to kill Samuel too. And probably some of the house slaves who might talk. It would be a massacre, not justice. And they'd hunt us down like animals," Jeremiah added. "Hang us from the nearest tree as an example to every slave in Mississippi. Our deaths wouldn't save David and Marcus. They'd just ensure that the next master would be even more careful about keeping his secrets." Moses looked up at his companions, his young face etched with lines that belonged on a much older man. "Then what? We just accept it? Let them destroy more lives while we stand by and watch?" The question struck at the heart of their dilemma. They were trapped between impossible choices, each path leading to destruction of one kind or another. Yet as they sat in the darkness, a different possibility began to take shape in Caesar's mind. "What if we didn't run or fight?" he said slowly. "What if we exposed him instead?" The others stared at him in confusion. Tobias was the first to speak. "Expose him to who? Who would believe the word of slaves against a white master?" "Not to other whites," Caesar replied, his voice gaining strength as the plan crystallized in his mind. "To his peers. To the very people whose opinions he values most." He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered through the barn's broken roof. "Think about it. Nathaniel Carter's power comes from his reputation, his standing in the community. What if that reputation was destroyed? What if the whispers became shouts and the rumors became undeniable truth?" Jeremiah's eyes widened as he began to understand. "You're talking about scandal, public humiliation." "I'm talking about using his own weapons against him," Caesar continued. "The master controls us through shame and fear. What if we turned that shame back on him, made it impossible for him to show his face in polite society?" Moses shook his head doubtfully. "But how? We're slaves. We can't exactly march into the Natchez social club and start spreading gossip." "No," Caesar agreed, "but we can make sure the right people see the right things at the right time. We can create situations where the truth becomes impossible to ignore." As the 4 men discussed the possibilities, a plan began to emerge. It was dangerous, requiring careful timing and considerable risk, but it offered something their other options did not: the possibility of destroying Nathaniel Carter without destroying themselves in the process. Meanwhile, in the big house, Evangeline Carter lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling as she listened to her husband's heavy footsteps in the hallway outside. She knew what those footsteps meant, knew that soon she would be summoned for another night of degradation. The routine had become as predictable as the sunrise, yet no less horrifying for its familiarity. A soft knock at her door confirmed her fears. Ruth entered, her face a mask of professional composure that couldn't quite hide the pain in her eyes. "Miss Evangeline," she said quietly, "the master requests your presence in the east parlor." Evangeline closed her eyes, gathering what remained of her strength. Which ones tonight? Caesar and Moses, miss. The names hit Evangeline like physical blows. Caesar, whose intelligence shone through despite his circumstances, and Moses, whose youth made every encounter feel like a fresh violation of innocence. She had long since stopped trying to understand her husband's selection process, had given up attempting to find logic in his choices. As she prepared herself for another night of humiliation, Evangeline found herself wondering, not for the first time, if death might be preferable to this existence. The thought came to her with increasing frequency, a dark comfort that whispered of escape from a situation that seemed to have no other solution. In the East Parlor, Nathaniel Carter waited with the patience of a predator. He had arranged the room carefully, positioning chairs and lighting candles to create the atmosphere he desired. The ritual had become as important to him as the act itself, each element designed to maximize his sense of control and power. When Evangeline entered, followed by Caesar and Moses, Nathaniel felt the familiar surge of excitement that had driven him to create this arrangement in the first place. The sight of his wife's resignation, the barely controlled fury in Caesar's eyes, the trembling of Moses' hands, all of it fed the twisted hunger that had consumed him completely. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the mock courtesy that made their situation even more degrading, "I trust you understand what is expected of you tonight." Neither man responded, their silence a small act of defiance that Nathaniel chose to ignore. He had learned to take his pleasure not just from the physical acts he forced upon them, but from the psychological destruction he witnessed in their eyes. As the night's degradation began, none of the participants could have imagined that their suffering was being observed. Hidden in the shadows outside the parlor window, a figure watched with growing horror and determination. Samuel, the overseer who had served the Carter family faithfully for over a decade, had finally seen enough to understand the true nature of the whispers that had been circulating throughout the plantation. What he witnessed that night would change everything, setting in motion events that would bring the Carter plantation's darkest secrets into the harsh light of day. The gathering storm was about to break, and when it did, no one would emerge unscathed. Samuel Hutchins had served as overseer of Carter Plantation for 12 years, his loyalty to the Carter family forged through shared hardships and mutual respect. A man of modest education, but considerable practical wisdom, he had always prided himself on maintaining order while treating the enslaved population with as much humanity as the system allowed. At 45, his weathered face bore the marks of countless days under the Mississippi sun, and his calloused hands spoke of a man who wasn't afraid of honest work. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he witnessed through the east parlor window on that humid September night. Samuel had been making his routine evening rounds, checking the security of the plantation's perimeter, when he noticed the unusual lighting in the east parlor. The room was typically used for formal entertaining, and its illumination at such a late hour struck him as odd. His sense of duty compelled him to investigate, thinking perhaps there had been some security breach or emergency that required his attention. What he saw through the partially open curtains shattered his understanding of the man he had served faithfully for over a decade. The scene unfolded before him like a nightmare made manifest. Nathaniel Carter, the master he had respected and defended, orchestrating acts of such profound degradation that Samuel's mind initially refused to process what his eyes were showing him. Evangeline Carter, the gentle lady he had known since her arrival as a young bride, reduced to a broken shell of her former self. And Caesar and Moses, two men Samuel had worked alongside for years, forced into participation in a tableau that violated every principle of human decency. Samuel's first instinct was to turn away, to pretend he had seen nothing and return to his quarters with his illusions intact. But something deeper than shock kept him rooted to the spot, a growing sense of moral outrage that overcame his initial paralysis. He watched for several more minutes, his horror deepening with each passing moment until he could bear no more. Stumbling away from the window, Samuel made his way to the small cabin that served as his quarters, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had witnessed. As overseer, he was responsible for maintaining order on the plantation, but how could he maintain order when the master himself was the source of chaos? How could he continue to serve a man whose actions violated every principle of Christian morality? Sleep eluded Samuel that night as he wrestled with his conscience. By dawn, he had reached a decision that would change the course of events at Carter Plantation forever. The next morning brought with it the oppressive heat that had become synonymous with the Mississippi summer, but for the first time in months, there was a subtle shift in the plantation's atmosphere. Samuel went about his duties with a grim determination that didn't go unnoticed by the enslaved population. His interactions with Caesar, Moses, Tobias, and Jeremiah carried an undercurrent of something that might have been sympathy, though none of the four men could quite identify what had changed. It was Jeremiah who first noticed Samuel's altered behavior. The overseer had always been fair in his dealings, but there was something different in his manner, a careful avoidance of eye contact, a hesitation in his voice when giving orders. When Jeremiah mentioned his observations to the others during their midday break, Caesar's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "He knows something," Caesar said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sounds of plantation life around them. "The question is, what does he plan to do about it?" Their answer came sooner than expected. That afternoon, as the four men worked in their respective areas, Samuel approached each of them individually with the same cryptic message. "Meet me at the old mill after evening prayers. Come alone and tell no one." The abandoned grist mill stood at the edge of the plantation's boundaries, its massive wheel long since fallen silent. Built in the early days of the Carter family's tenure, it had been replaced by more modern facilities and left to decay among the cypress trees that lined the creek. It was here that Samuel waited as the sun set over the Mississippi landscape, his face etched with the weight of the decision he had made. Caesar arrived first, his massive frame moving cautiously through the gathering darkness. The blacksmith's eyes scanned the area for signs of a trap, his muscles tensed for flight or fight as circumstances might demand. Samuel's presence alone in such an isolated location could mean anything from a private conversation to an elaborate setup designed to eliminate troublesome slaves. "Samuel," Caesar said carefully, maintaining a respectful distance. "You wanted to see me?" The overseer turned, and in the fading light, Caesar could see something in the man's eyes that he had never witnessed before, a mixture of shame, anger, and what might have been genuine remorse. "I saw," Samuel said simply, his voice heavy with emotion, "last night. I saw what he makes you do." The words hit Caesar like a physical blow. For 2 years they had lived with the constant fear of discovery, knowing that exposure could mean death for all of them. Now, faced with the reality of a witness, Caesar felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. "What do you plan to do about it?" Caesar asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark water of the creek. "I've been asking myself that same question all day. I've served this family for 12 years, Caesar. I thought I knew the man I worked for. And now? Now I know I've been serving a monster." Samuel's voice carried a bitterness that spoke of shattered illusions and moral awakening. "The question is, what does a man do when he discovers he's been complicit in evil?" Before Caesar could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of the others. Tobias, Jeremiah, and Moses emerged from the shadows, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and hope that Caesar felt in his own heart. Samuel looked at the four men gathered before him, seeing them perhaps for the first time, not as property or tools, but as human beings whose suffering had been ignored for far too long. "I know what you're thinking," he said, addressing all of them. "You're wondering if this is a trap, if I'm here to gather evidence against you or to test your loyalty. I don't blame you for that suspicion. In your position, I'd feel the same way." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But I'm not here as an overseer or as a representative of Nathaniel Carter. I'm here as a man who's seen something that violates every principle of human decency, and I want to help you stop it." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and danger. Moses was the first to speak, his young voice carrying a note of desperate hope. "Help us how? You're one man against the entire system. Even if you wanted to help, what could you do?" Samuel's response surprised them all. "More than you might think. I have access to the master's correspondence, his business records, his social calendar. I know which neighbors he's trying to impress, which debts he's trying to hide, which secrets he's most afraid of having exposed." Caesar's eyes widened as he began to understand the implications. "You're talking about using his own information against him. I'm talking about making sure the right people learn the truth about what happens in this house," Samuel replied. "Nathaniel Carter's power comes from his reputation in the community. If that reputation were destroyed, he'd be ruined," Jeremiah finished, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror at the audacity of the plan. Samuel nodded. "Completely. A man like Carter can survive financial setbacks, crop failures, even natural disasters, but he can't survive the kind of scandal that would result from the exposure of his arrangements." Tobias shook his head doubtfully. "But who would believe such accusations? We're slaves. Our word means nothing against his. Your word alone, perhaps not," Samuel agreed. "But what if there were physical evidence, documents, witnesses, proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away?" As the 5 men stood in the shadow of the abandoned mill, a conspiracy began to take shape that would shake the foundations of Carter Plantation. Samuel's position as overseer gave him access to information and opportunities that the 4 enslaved men could never have obtained on their own. Combined with their intimate knowledge of Nathaniel Carter's routines and preferences, they possessed the tools necessary to orchestrate his downfall. The plan they developed was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and considerable courage from all involved. Samuel would use his access to Carter's correspondence to identify the most influential members of local society, while the 4 men would create opportunities for those individuals to witness evidence of the master's depravity. "There's something else you should know," Samuel said as their meeting drew to a close. "I heard the master talking to his wife yesterday. He's planning to host a dinner party next month. All the prominent families in the area will be attending. If we're going to act, that might be our best opportunity." Caesar nodded slowly, understanding the significance of the timing. A gathering of the local elite would provide the perfect audience for their revelation, ensuring that news of Carter's disgrace would spread throughout the community with maximum speed and impact. As the 5 conspirators prepared to return to their respective quarters, each man understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They were no longer simply victims of Nathaniel Carter's perversions. They had become active agents in his destruction. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called out its mournful song. But for the first time in 2 years, the sound carried with it not just sorrow, but the promise of justice to come. The weeks following the clandestine meeting at the old mill transformed Carter Plantation into a stage where every actor played multiple roles. By day, the routine of plantation life continued unchanged. Cotton was picked, horses were tended, furniture was crafted, and iron was forged. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a carefully orchestrated plan began to take shape, each participant playing their part with the precision of seasoned conspirators. Samuel Hutchins proved to be an invaluable ally, his position as overseer providing access to information that would have been impossible for the enslaved men to obtain. Through careful examination of Nathaniel Carter's correspondence, he discovered that the planned dinner party was intended to be more than a simple social gathering. Carter was attempting to secure a substantial loan from a consortium of wealthy planters, money he needed to expand his cotton operations and maintain his position among the Mississippi elite. The guest list read like a directory of the most influential families in the territory. The Whitmores, whose plantation rivaled Carter's in size and productivity, the Beauregards, whose political connections extended all the way to Washington, the Thorntons, whose banking interests controlled much of the region's financial infrastructure, and the Montgomerys, whose social standing made them arbiters of respectability throughout the Mississippi Territory. "This is perfect," Caesar said during one of their secret meetings in the abandoned tobacco barn. "If we can expose him in front of these people, his reputation will be destroyed overnight." Samuel nodded grimly. "But we'll only get one chance. If we fail, or if our plan is discovered beforehand, it won't just be the four of you who suffer. Carter will know I was involved, and he'll make sure I disappear permanently." The weight of that reality settled over the group like a shroud. They were all risking everything on a single gamble, with no guarantee of success and the certainty of terrible consequences if they failed. Jeremiah, whose carpentry work often took him into the main house, had been tasked with gathering intelligence about the layout and timing of the dinner party. His observations revealed that Carter planned to use the East Parlor, the same room where his nightly degradations took place, as a private meeting space where he could discuss business matters away from the other guests. "He's planning to take potential investors there after dinner," Jeremiah reported. "He wants to show them his private collection. Apparently he has some rare books and artifacts that he thinks will impress them." Moses, despite his youth, had proven surprisingly adept at gathering information from the house slaves. His gentle manner and obvious vulnerability had earned him the trust of several women who worked in the kitchen and cleaning staff, and through careful questioning, he had learned crucial details about the evening's planned schedule. "Dinner will be served at 7, he reported. "The ladies will retire to the drawing room afterward, while the men adjourn to the study for cigars and brandy. That's when the master plans to take his most important guests to the East Parlor for private discussions." Tobias, whose work in the stables gave him knowledge of the comings and goings of various plantation visitors, had identified the perfect witness for their plan. Dr. Elias Pemberton, the territory's most respected physician and a man whose moral authority was unquestioned throughout the region, was scheduled to attend the dinner party. More importantly, he was known to suffer from insomnia and often took late evening walks to help him sleep. "If we can arrange for Dr. Pemberton to witness what happens in the East Parlor," Tobias suggested, "his testimony would be unassailable. No one would dare question his word." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its audacity. On the night of the dinner party, they would create a situation that would force Nathaniel Carter to summon his wife and at least 2 of the 4 men to the East Parlor while his guests were still on the property. Samuel would then ensure that Dr. Pemberton was positioned to witness the degradation, providing irrefutable testimony to Carter's depravity. But as the date of the dinner party approached, complications began to emerge that threatened to derail their carefully laid plans. The first crisis came when Evangeline Carter, perhaps sensing the change in atmosphere around the plantation, began to exhibit signs of a complete nervous breakdown. Her already fragile mental state deteriorated rapidly, and she spent increasing amounts of time in her room, refusing to eat and speaking to no one except Ruth, her loyal maid. "She's not going to be able to participate in the dinner party," Ruth confided to Moses during one of their carefully orchestrated encounters. "The master is furious, but she just sits by her window and stares out at nothing. I'm afraid she's losing her mind completely." This development posed a serious threat to their plan. which depended on Evangeline's presence in the East Parlor to provide the full scope of Carter's perversions. Without her, the scene they hoped to orchestrate would lose much of its impact. The second crisis emerged when Samuel discovered that Carter had been making inquiries about the loyalty of his enslaved population. The master had apparently noticed subtle changes in behavior and atmosphere around the plantation, and his paranoia was beginning to focus on the possibility of organized resistance. "He's been asking questions about all of you," Samuel warned during one of their meetings. "He wants to know if I've noticed any signs of insubordination or unusual behavior. I've managed to deflect his suspicions so far, but he's becoming increasingly watchful." The third and most dangerous complication arose when David, the young stable hand whom Carter had been considering for inclusion in his collection, approached Tobias with disturbing news. "The master's been watching me," David said, his 18-year-old face etched with fear. "He asks me questions about my family, about my personal habits. Yesterday, he had me come to the big house to move some furniture, and he kept staring at me in a way that made my skin crawl." The realization that Carter might be planning to expand his collection before the dinner party sent waves of panic through the conspiracy. If David were forced into the arrangement before their plan could be executed, it would not only destroy another innocent life, but also potentially expose their plot. "We have to move faster," Caesar declared during an emergency meeting. "We can't wait for the perfect moment. We have to create it ourselves." Samuel's response was grim but determined. "Then we accelerate the timeline. The dinner party is in 5 days. We'll have to make our move that night, regardless of whether all the conditions are perfect." As the conspirators refined their plan, each man grappled with the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were not simply seeking to expose Nathaniel Carter's crimes. They were challenging the entire social order that made such crimes possible. In a society where enslaved people were considered property rather than human beings, their actions constituted not just rebellion, but revolution. Caesar, as the eldest and most respected among them, felt the weight of leadership heavily. His literacy, hidden from all but his closest allies, had given him a broader understanding of the world beyond the plantation's boundaries. He knew that their actions would have consequences far beyond Carter Plantation, potentially inspiring other enslaved people to resist their oppressors or triggering a violent backlash that could result in widespread suffering. Tobias struggled with the moral implications of their plan, his gentle nature rebelling against the deception and manipulation required for success. Yet his love for the horses in his care, creatures who depended on him for protection and comfort, reminded him daily of what it meant to be powerless in the hands of those who viewed you as property. Jeremiah channeled his anxiety into his work, crafting pieces of furniture with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Each joint he cut, each surface he smoothed, became an act of defiance against the forces that sought to reduce him to nothing more than a tool for another man's pleasure. Moses, despite his youth, displayed a maturity that impressed his older companions. His ability to gather information from the house slaves had proven invaluable, but more importantly, his unwavering determination to protect David from Carter's predations had become a driving force for the entire group. Samuel, perhaps more than any of the others, understood the full scope of what they were risking. As a white man in a position of authority, he had options that the enslaved men did not. He could have simply requested a transfer to another plantation, or even left the territory entirely. His decision to remain and fight alongside them was a testament to the depth of his moral awakening. As the night of the dinner party approached, each member of the conspiracy made their final preparations. Samuel ensured that he had copies of key documents that might be needed as evidence. Caesar, Tobias, Jeremiah, and Moses rehearsed their roles until every movement was automatic. And in the big house, Evangeline Carter sat by her window, unaware that her suffering was about to become the catalyst for her husband's destruction. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, and the night birds sang their mournful songs. But for 5 men bound together by shared purpose and desperate hope, the approaching darkness held not terror, but the promise of justice finally served. October 15th, 1789, dawned with an oppressive humidity that seemed to press against the very soul of Carter Plantation. The Spanish moss hung motionless in the still air, and even the usually active wildlife seemed subdued by the weight of the approaching evening. In the big house, preparations for the dinner party proceeded with mechanical precision, though those who knew where to look could detect an undercurrent of tension that spoke of secrets about to be revealed. Evangeline Carter had been coaxed from her room by Ruth's gentle persistence and Dr. Pemberton's professional intervention. The physician, arriving early to check on his patient, had prescribed a mild sedative that would allow her to function through the evening's social obligations, while maintaining the fragile composure necessary for public appearances. "She's very delicate," Dr. Pemberton confided to Nathaniel as they stood in the main hallway. "I'm concerned about her mental state. Perhaps it would be wise to consider sending her to visit relatives in Charleston for an extended rest." Nathaniel's response was carefully measured, though those who knew him well might have detected the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated suppressed anger. "Evangeline has always been sensitive to the heat. I'm sure she'll recover once the weather breaks." Dr. Pemberton studied his host with the penetrating gaze of a man accustomed to reading the subtle signs of human distress. At 62, he had served as physician to the plantation elite for over 3 decades, and his experience had taught him to recognize the symptoms of moral corruption as readily as those of physical disease. "Nevertheless," the doctor continued, "I would recommend avoiding any undue stress during her recovery period. The mind, like the body, requires rest to heal properly." The warning was subtle but unmistakable, and Nathaniel understood that his wife's condition was being closely monitored by a man whose opinion carried considerable weight in the community. This development added another layer of complexity to an evening that was already fraught with hidden dangers. As the afternoon progressed, the other guests began to arrive in their elegant carriages, each family bringing with them the weight of social expectation and political influence that made them so valuable to Nathaniel's plans. The Whitmores arrived first, their carriage bearing the coat of arms that proclaimed their status as one of the territory's founding families. Mrs. Abigail Whitmore, resplendent in silk and pearls, greeted Evangeline with the cool courtesy that had become standard since the rumors began circulating. The Beauregards followed, their political connections evident in the deference shown to them by the other guests. Senator James Beauregard, a man whose influence extended to the highest levels of territorial government, carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to shaping the destiny of nations. The Thorntons and Montgomerys completed the gathering, their combined wealth and social standing representing the pinnacle of Mississippi Territory society. As the guests assembled in the main drawing room, the conversation flowed with the practiced ease of people who had known each other for decades, though careful observers might have noticed the subtle undercurrents of tension that spoke of unspoken knowledge and carefully guarded secrets. In the kitchen, the enslaved staff worked with unusual intensity, their movements betraying the nervous energy that had infected the entire plantation. Ruth, supervising the final preparations for dinner, found herself glancing repeatedly toward the windows as if expecting some catastrophic event to materialize from the gathering darkness. Moses, assigned to serve at table during the dinner, moved through his duties with the careful precision of someone acutely aware that every action was being observed. His youth and apparent innocence made him nearly invisible to the white guests, a fact that would prove crucial to the evening's planned revelations. In the stables, Tobias tended to the guests' horses with his usual gentle efficiency, though his mind was focused entirely on the timing of events yet to come. The success of their plan depended on precise coordination, and any deviation from the carefully rehearsed schedule could result in disaster for all involved. Jeremiah, whose carpentry work had provided him with intimate knowledge of the house's layout, made final adjustments to the east parlor, ensuring that the room was prepared for the scene that would soon unfold within its walls. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the furniture, knowing that within hours this space would become the stage for Nathaniel Carter's ultimate humiliation. Caesar worked in the smithy with methodical intensity, each strike of his hammer marking the passage of time toward the moment of truth. His literacy, hidden from all but his closest allies, had allowed him to understand the broader implications of their actions. They were not simply seeking revenge against one man. They were challenging the entire system that made such abuses possible. Samuel Hutchins moved through his evening rounds with the appearance of routine normalcy, though his mind was focused entirely on the complex series of events he would soon set in motion. In his quarters, carefully hidden beneath loose floorboards, lay copies of documents that would provide irrefutable evidence of Carter's financial desperation and moral corruption. As dinner was served in the main dining room, the conversation flowed with the practiced elegance of Southern society at its finest. The guests discussed politics, agriculture, and social matters with the easy confidence of people secure in their position at the top of the social hierarchy. Nathaniel Carter played the role of gracious host with consummate skill, though those who knew where to look might have detected the slight tension in his shoulders that betrayed his inner anxiety. "The cotton market has been particularly favorable this season," Senator Beauregard observed, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinions shaped territorial policy. "I trust your yields have been satisfactory, Nathaniel?" "Quite satisfactory," Carter replied, though Samuel, serving wine from the sideboard, knew that the plantation's financial situation was far more precarious than his master was willing to admit. "In fact, I've been considering expansion opportunities that might interest investors of vision and discretion." The conversation that followed was a carefully choreographed dance of financial seduction, with Carter gradually introducing the topic of investment opportunities, while his guests maintained the polite interest of people accustomed to evaluating such proposals. Dr. Pemberton, seated at Carter's right hand, observed the proceedings with the detached interest of someone whose wealth came from professional service rather than agricultural speculation. As the evening progressed through its carefully planned stages, each member of the conspiracy moved into position for the climactic scene that would determine their fate. Moses, clearing dishes from the dining room, caught Samuel's eye and received an almost imperceptible nod that confirmed the timeline remained on schedule. In her room above, Evangeline Carter sat before her mirror while Ruth helped her prepare for what both women sensed would be a night unlike any other. The sedative prescribed by Dr. Pemberton had steadied her nerves, but it could not entirely suppress the sense of impending catastrophe that had haunted her for weeks. "Miss Evangeline," Ruth said softly as she arranged her mistress's hair, "whatever happens tonight, remember that you are not alone. There are people who care about you, who want to see you free from this nightmare." Evangeline's reflection in the mirror showed a woman aged beyond her years, but for the first time in months, there was a spark of something that might have been hope in her eyes. "Do you really believe that, Ruth? Do you think this suffering might finally end? I believe that justice has a way of finding even the darkest corners," Ruth replied, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "And I believe that your suffering has not been in vain." As the dinner concluded and the guests prepared to adjourn to separate rooms according to the customs of the time, Nathaniel Carter felt the familiar surge of anticipation that preceded his most private entertainments. The evening had proceeded exactly as planned, with his potential investors showing appropriate interest in his expansion proposals. Now came the delicate task of demonstrating his power and sophistication in ways that would cement their confidence in his capabilities. "Gentlemen," he announced as the ladies retired to the drawing room, "I have some rare acquisitions in my private study that might interest you. Perhaps we could continue our discussions in more intimate surroundings." Dr. Pemberton, pleading fatigue from his long day of medical rounds, excused himself from the group and stepped onto the veranda for what he described as a brief constitutional before retiring. His departure was noted by Samuel, who understood that the crucial witness was now in position for the revelation that would destroy Nathaniel Carter forever. As the remaining men followed their host toward the east parlor, none of them could have imagined that they were about to witness a scene that would shatter their understanding of the man they had known for years. The conspiracy that had been months in the making was about to reach its climactic moment, and the fate of everyone on Carter Plantation hung in the balance. The Spanish moss swayed gently in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called out its mournful song. But for 5 conspirators bound together by shared purpose and desperate hope, the approaching darkness held not terror, but the promise of justice finally served. The East Parlor had been transformed into a shrine to Nathaniel Carter's twisted desires, its elegant furnishings arranged to facilitate the degradation he had come to crave above all else. Candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, their flickering light creating an atmosphere of intimacy that made the room's true purpose all the more obscene. As Carter led his distinguished guests into this space, he felt the familiar surge of power that came from controlling every aspect of his private domain. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to command, "I trust you'll find my collection illuminating." Senator Beauregard, Mr. Whitmore, and the other investors settled into their chairs with the easy comfort of men discussing business among peers. They had come expecting to see rare books, perhaps some artifacts from Carter's travels, the usual displays of wealth and culture that marked a successful planter's private study. What they could not have anticipated was the carefully orchestrated sequence of events that Samuel Hutchins had set in motion from his position in the main hallway. At precisely 10:30, as planned, a house slave appeared at the parlor door with a message that required Carter's immediate attention. The master excused himself briefly, stepping into the hallway where Samuel waited with news of a supposed emergency in the slave quarters that demanded immediate resolution. "What is it, Samuel?" Carter asked, his irritation evident at being interrupted during such a crucial moment with his investors. "There's been an incident, sir," Samuel replied, his voice carefully modulated to convey urgency without alarm. "Caesar and Moses were involved in an altercation. I thought you might want to address the situation personally, given the delicate nature of tonight's gathering." Carter's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications. The mention of Caesar and Moses by name was no accident. Samuel knew exactly which slaves held special significance for his master. The suggestion of personal intervention carried with it the promise of the kind of private discipline that Carter found most satisfying. "Bring them to the East Parlor," Carter commanded, his voice dropping to the low tone that indicated his arousal was already building. "And summon my wife. She should witness how I maintain order among my property." Samuel nodded with the deference expected of a loyal overseer, though his heart pounded with the knowledge that he was setting in motion events that would destroy the man he had served for 12 years. "At once, sir." "Should I inform your guests that you'll be delayed?" "No," Carter replied, his breathing already becoming shallow with anticipation. "They can observe how a true master maintains discipline. It will demonstrate the thoroughness of my management style." As Samuel departed to gather the unwilling participants in Carter's final performance, Dr. Pemberton completed his circuit of the veranda and positioned himself near the east parlor's French doors. The physician's insomnia, which had plagued him for years, had proven to be an unexpected blessing for the conspirators' plan. His habit of taking evening walks was well known among the plantation elite, making his presence outside the parlor appear entirely natural. Inside the parlor, Carter returned to his guests with barely contained excitement. "Gentlemen, you're about to witness something that will demonstrate the absolute authority necessary for successful plantation management. I trust you'll appreciate the educational value of what you're about to see." The investors exchanged glances of mild confusion, uncertain what their host intended but willing to indulge what they assumed would be a brief demonstration of slave discipline. Senator Beauregard, whose own plantation employed similarly harsh methods of control, nodded approvingly. "Discipline is indeed the foundation of order," the senator agreed. "I'm curious to see your methods, Nathaniel." Within minutes, the parlor door opened to admit the players in Carter's twisted drama. Evangeline entered first, her sedated composure barely masking the terror in her eyes as she recognized the familiar setting of her nightly degradation. Ruth had dressed her in a simple white gown that emphasized her fragility, making her appear more like a sacrificial victim than the mistress of a great plantation. Caesar and Moses followed, their faces masks of carefully controlled rage. Both men understood that they were walking into a trap, but they also knew that this trap represented their only chance for freedom. Caesar's massive frame seemed to fill the doorway, his intelligence evident in the way his eyes quickly assessed the room's occupants and layout. Moses, despite his youth, carried himself with a dignity that no amount of degradation had been able to destroy. "Gentlemen," Carter announced to his bewildered guests, "allow me to demonstrate the proper relationship between master and property." What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Carter began by ordering his wife to disrobe, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man directing servants in their daily tasks. The investors watched in growing horror as Evangeline, moving like a woman in a trance, began to comply with her husband's commands. The realization of what they were witnessing dawned slowly, their minds initially refusing to process the magnitude of the depravity unfolding before them. "Good God, Nathaniel," Mr. Whitmore gasped, rising from his chair in shock. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" Carter's response was to laugh, a sound devoid of any human warmth or sanity. "I'm showing you power, gentlemen, true power, the ability to command absolute obedience from every soul under my dominion." He then turned to Caesar and Moses, his commands becoming increasingly explicit and degrading. The two men stood frozen, caught between their desire to protect their own dignity and their knowledge that resistance would mean death, not just for themselves, but for everyone they cared about. It was at this moment that Dr. Pemberton, positioned outside the French doors, witnessed the full scope of Carter's madness. The physician's medical training had exposed him to the full range of human suffering and depravity, but nothing had prepared him for the scene unfolding in the candlelit parlor. His sharp intake of breath was audible through the glass, though none of the room's occupants noticed the sound. Inside the parlor, the investors had risen to their feet in collective horror. Senator Beauregard, whose political career depended on maintaining an image of moral rectitude, backed toward the door with his face pale with shock. "This is monstrous," he declared, his voice shaking with outrage. "You're not demonstrating power, Nathaniel. You're revealing yourself to be a degenerate of the worst kind." Carter's response was to grab Evangeline by the arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises on her pale skin. "You don't understand," he snarled, his facade of civilized behavior crumbling completely. "This is what real control looks like. This is what separates the strong from the weak." But his words fell on deaf ears. The investors were already moving toward the exit, their faces reflecting a mixture of disgust and horror that would ensure Carter's social destruction. "Mr. Thornton, whose banking connections controlled much of the territory's financial infrastructure, paused at the door long enough to deliver a final judgment. "You'll never receive a penny of investment from any respectable source," he declared. "What we've witnessed here tonight will be reported to every person of standing in the territory. You've destroyed yourself, Nathaniel, and you've destroyed your family's name forever." As the investors fled the parlor, Carter's carefully constructed world began to collapse around him. The realization that his secret had been exposed to the very people whose approval he most desperately needed sent him into a rage that bordered on madness. He released Evangeline, who collapsed to the floor in a sobbing heap, and turned his fury on Caesar and Moses. "This is your fault," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You've ruined everything. I'll see you both hanged for this." But Caesar, freed from the constraints that had bound him for 2 years, finally allowed his rage to surface. "We've ruined nothing," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the room. "We've simply allowed the world to see what you really are." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Carter, driven beyond reason by the collapse of his carefully maintained facade, lunged at Caesar with a letter opener from his desk. The blacksmith, whose strength had been honed by years of working iron, easily deflected the attack and restrained his former master with minimal effort. It was in this tableau, Carter held helpless by the man he had degraded, Evangeline sobbing on the floor, Moses standing guard at the door, that Dr. Pemberton chose to make his entrance through the French doors. "I believe," the physician said, with the calm authority of a man accustomed to crisis, "that this situation requires immediate medical and legal intervention." The arrival of Dr. Pemberton, whose reputation for integrity was unassailable throughout the territory, marked the final collapse of Nathaniel Carter's power. The physician's testimony about what he had witnessed would carry more weight than any other evidence, ensuring that the truth about Carter Plantation would spread throughout Mississippi society with the speed of wildfire. In the days that followed, the consequences of that night's revelations rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The investors who had fled the East Parlor carried their horror to every drawing room and gentleman's club in the territory. Within a week, the Carter name had become synonymous with depravity and moral corruption. Nathaniel Carter, faced with complete social and financial ruin, suffered a complete mental breakdown. He was eventually committed to an asylum in New Orleans, where he spent his remaining years raving about conspiracies and betrayals that existed only in his fractured mind. Evangeline, freed from her nightmare but broken by years of abuse, was taken in by her sister in Charleston. Under the care of family and physicians, she slowly began the long process of healing, though she would never fully recover from the trauma she had endured. The 4 men who had risked everything to expose Carter's crimes found their lives transformed in ways they had never dared imagine. Samuel Hutchins, whose courage had made their plan possible, used his knowledge of plantation management to establish himself as an independent agricultural consultant. His reputation for integrity, enhanced by his role in exposing Carter's crimes, made him highly sought after throughout the territory. Caesar, Tobias, Jeremiah, and Moses were granted their freedom as part of the legal settlement that followed Carter's commitment. Caesar used his literacy and intelligence to establish a blacksmith shop in Natchez, becoming one of the first free black businessmen in the territory. Tobias found work training horses for wealthy planters who valued his gentle touch with animals. Jeremiah's carpentry skills were in high demand among families seeking to distance themselves from anything associated with the Carter name. Moses, despite his youth, became a powerful voice for the rights of enslaved people, his eloquence and dignity inspiring others to resist their oppression. The Carter Plantation itself was sold to pay debts and legal settlements, its grand mansion eventually falling into decay as Spanish moss reclaimed the once manicured grounds. The East Parlour, scene of so much suffering and ultimate justice, was sealed and abandoned, becoming a monument to the consequences of unchecked power and moral corruption. But perhaps the most significant consequence of that October night was the message it sent throughout the Mississippi Territory and beyond. The fall of Nathaniel Carter demonstrated that even the most powerful men were not immune to the consequences of their actions, that secrets could not remain hidden forever, and that justice, however delayed, would eventually find its way into even the darkest corners of human experience. The Spanish moss still sways in the Mississippi breeze, and the night birds still sing their mournful songs. But the story of Carter Plantation serves as an eternal reminder that no amount of wealth or power can protect those who choose to abandon their humanity in pursuit of their basest desires. In the end, the truth will always find a way to shine its light into the darkness, and those who have suffered in silence will find their voices heard at last. The ruin of the Carter family was complete, but from that ruin came a kind of redemption, not for Nathaniel Carter, whose crimes were beyond forgiveness, but for those who had suffered under his dominion and who had found the courage to ensure that their suffering would not be in vain.